Looks like we got another full agenda today. So, going back to last Tuesday, obviously there's been a lot of discussion about last Tuesday. So, do we want to talk about that at all this evening?
Oh,
Bob?
if I might, Mr. Mayor, I've had quite a bit of correspondence, both in person and telephone and emails, and I noticed a lot of the emails had gone to everybody else regarding our decision on the Plains property. And I guess I'm getting the impression that a lot of those people didn't quite understand that that was the final stamp of approval when we were going to proceed with the contract. They thought it was pretty much, at least my impression is they thought it was kind of a done deal. And I guess what I'd like to do is ask council to see if we would reconsider bringing this forward again, because a couple items, I think there was a lot of misunderstanding on the part of the public what we were doing. And the second thing is, I think we didn't get much chance to talk about the economics of the project. And that's what you have to look at the economics, I think, to see if it's gonna work or not, or at least get some feel for it. And after we had gone through the pictures and so forth and the layout, it just didn't leave any time to do that.
Okay.
So I guess I would request that we might want to at least reconsider bringing this forward again. So.
Well, if we do that, there's no reason to get into a debate on the pros and cons of the sale itself. It's just a question of whether there's a sense of council to put it on the agenda. I guess it would be for the 5th of November. So I think everyone's had a chance to think about it. How many people would like to reconsider and discuss it again on the 5th?
I'm abstaining.
Okay, so we've got everyone 7 to 1.
I know.
So would you add that to the agenda, Mr. Pickwick,
Yes, sir.
for the 5th, and we'll discuss it again. Okay, I think that's all. Anything else about last Tuesday? We'll talk about trees and we'll talk about parking, and okay, we'll do that later today. So I guess we can head out to the to the lobby and start looking at or go through the wayfinding.
Your Honor, there's going to be a presentation by the consultant to kind of kick things off. You all saw him setting up.
Okay.
And again, there's a lot of general public that will be intermingled with you all. We had phenomenal
Are we good on the wayfinding then?
correct, and we'll let you know when it comes out online, but at least you had some visuals on some of the graphics, and we'll get input again online. We'll have the boards up in the lobby for the next week or so, and then we are taking those up to the same presentation, the bar none, later tonight for their council.
Before we move on to that, something I overlooked is as far as the going back to the Plains discussion on the 5th. Apparently the rules say that all of us have to be at the meeting. So Steve, you and I will have to be on the phone for that.
Yeah, not gonna be in self-service.
Does he have to be since
I
he's
abstain,
abstaining?
so.
He abstained.
John, would you address that if you don't mind?
Yeah, typically I would say that because you were there, you were logged in, all members were present when you started, that would nevertheless be a requirement. There's a possibility, I haven't really looked at it, so I don't know, but there's a possibility you might be able to suspend the rules or the vote of 2/3 of those present for that particular rule, but I don't know that. I've looked at the Robert's Rules of Order and our local council rules, but I haven't looked at any cases to see if this has come up and if there's really some better authority or more detailed authority on this particular kind of.
Okay. Well, you can send us all an
It
email
says
when you've done
2008
your
too.
homework on that and let us know what the options are.
It's called a satellite phone, Steve.
Yeah.
Apparently the resolution was written without people thinking about these possibilities, so. Okay, let's move on then. under the parking study.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. The next item on the agenda is the downtown parking study. It's a follow-up discussion from, I believe, a presentation that we received on September 24th. We are looking for some direction, particularly on the parking meter issue. And if I may, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Becker and Chief Feeders to do the follow-up presentation.
Okay.
Your Honor, members of council, I know the chief will be joining me up here shortly, but I know there were 3 of you physically missing from the last meeting. So what we did was to put together a recap in your council memo, kind of on some of the key points that were covered, because we presented, it was well over an hour on that last discussion. But I wanted to hit some of the high points. When we put the plan together, which started last year, we did engage stakeholders from the downtown businesses as part of the steering committee, as we do with every NPO study. We do recognize that there's ample and affordable parking currently in the downtown and Old Yellowstone district. We're gonna show you a map here in a minute. Parking turnover is critical for commercial success. That was highlighted tremendously through the whole plan that was emailed out to you after the last work session. The addition of downtown residential dwelling units has increased parking 24/7 in the downtown core, but we like that. Downtown business owners and citizens expressed their concern, and we heard that repeatedly, not only during the study, but since, that employees in the downtown can tend to park in front of their businesses or other businesses for greater parts of the work week. We did also recognize that a lot of the downtown development projects that we have going on downtown do take up parking spaces on the street. We recognize business owners do need to help self-enforce in addition to the enforcement our police department has. We do recognize that the Casper Police Department could increase additional enforcement efforts downtown with additional personnel, and then the software reporting that the chief talked about last go around. Placement of parking meters we discussed on select downtown streets could increase parking turnover, and the use of the downtown parking garage, and consideration of visitors to Casper could incorporate a complimentary meter program for short trips. That was referenced because we don't want to run our guests off with paid parking. Just to give you all a visual on this study, again, it was analyzing the parking situation in the Old Yellowstone district, the green, as well as obviously our downtown core in the purple, but also in this entire orange area. And again, we have a lot of overflow there with the residential component. And again, residential downtown is one of your council goals. One of the other boards that I found interesting and wanted to highlight is the inventory that the consultant did. And they spent time, literally boots on the ground, doing the counting in the blue parking spaces, and again, both off-street, privately held parking lots as well as public parking lots. Again, downtown was the blue, Old Yellowstone district is the green. The Goodstein lot, for instance, 343 spots. It is not identified as a public parking lot. We don't own it, so it was considered private because it is owned by the state, but that was one of the big inventories there. But taking a look at the amount of parking in the Old Yellowstone district in particular, it is all privately held in this area. And again, the only kicker, a little bit different, is in fact the lot that is north of Kalarks, which is in fact owned by the city. But then in the blue, you're also looking at a good mix of both privately owned as well as publicly owned lots. Our own downtown parking lot being publicly counted in there, as well as the lot at Center Street being probably some of the biggest parking we have. Public parking that we own around the Village Inn downtown too is one of our public spots. But this graphic kind of shows all of you what we're looking at as the lots. Now, the other graphic that I wanted to pull out is the on-street. And again, they did an inventory here to look at the green, which is in fact the 2-hour flagged lots where we have the signage that says 2-hour only. And we do that quite a bit in the downtown core. That's going to come into play as far as enforcement goes, because we recognize every 2 hours we need to see the turnover, and that also would take the police chief's team to enforce that. With the black, we have no parking flagged, and we again have that in several areas. And again, a lot of it happening in some of our construction as well as along First Street, which of course is owned by the state. So that inventory was done. The one I think is of interest too is peak hour occupancy. Now this one ties into how we looked at potentially putting meters on key downtown streets. So looking at the ones that have the most occupancy, occurring 90%, 85 to 90%, and 75. So looking again at the peak hours at around 10 a.m. and how much parking is occurring, I want to draw your attention, let me put this upside down, to again the section of town. Again, we're looking at red, orange, and yellow being, in fact, this area, of course, along the First Street corridor, the Second Street. Again, these were the streets that we were identifying as far as Wolcott and Center and Second Street, and then somewhat with Davis Street being the ones that we were thinking if we needed to do metered parking, they in fact have the most use and the parking occurring the most frequently. So again, a different visual on what is happening in our downtown, which I think most of us see, but then in a graphical example that was published in the report, I wanted y'all to kind of look at this. I think that was pretty much the visuals, and what we had brought forward for tonight was in fact that we would like some direction. The parking meter component is of importance, and then investment in training and staff development, and that's the chief's area of expertise.
So the primary concern facing us tonight is we were tasked by council in our city council goals to address the implementation of the parking study. We recognized immediately that we would need direction from staff regarding the parking meters. That would give us direction on how to implement the other aspects of the parking study. So it's been mentioned frequently that we could do more enforcement down there. That is true. The CSOs, the community service officers of the Casper Police Department, are the people that are tasked with the parking enforcement responsibilities. We've undergone some personnel changes in that area, so we're vastly understaffed right now. So here in the most recent months, there's not been a lot of parking enforcement of that 2-hour limit. If we were to go back to a dedicated person to that parking enforcement, that would increase the enforcement. And so at this point, although we're, no matter what direction we go, enforcement's going to be a key component of that. There's still, that responsibility is going to fall on the police department, and we're prepared to go whatever direction council wants us to go. For us to be able to make and present plans to you to implement the rest of that parking study, we do need direction on whether or not parking meters, which is one of the primary components of the study, is something that we want and desire for Casper today and Casper tomorrow.
Questions for Chief or Liz? Steve?
Let's assume we go to enforcement. And one of the things that's been mentioned in the study and by the DDA and everybody else is that we have an issue with the business owners and their employees parking in customer spots. Is it possible, because we all know we can track license plates to owners, is it possible though to put a penalty or a more severe penalty on the employee or the business owner that's taking advantage of that versus Joe Blow citizen?
Mayor, Councilman, that's a very good question. Typically store owners do not report to me their employee rosters. And police department also, in an era where you have constitutional rights, we generally don't inquire except under terms of arrest where you work, and so that is going to get complicated. I would also submit to you that the turnover rate for employees in those types of businesses is high, and that would be very difficult to track that.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
I guess I'd like to also bring up, I think there's an unfair assumption that all of these parking spaces are taken up by workers in retail establishments. There are a lot of people that work in office buildings that have no incentive whatsoever for parking turnover, and if they can get away with parking in a spot all day long and it's free, why not? And so, because I know that the DCBA, and they're working very hard to get their employees to not park in front of their businesses, and it's hard to say how successful they are, but they aren't the only violators.
Quite true.
Chief?
So, and I know that I mentioned it before, but I would reiterate that the parking enforcement is labor intensive. It takes boots on the ground to do that. It takes somebody to go around to document the vehicle as it exists, document the place that it's parked, the manner in which it's parked, and record that. And then we have to wait that 2 hours and 1 minute and come back and verify that that same vehicle has not moved. It's in the same spot. Its tires are unmoved. That creates a great deal of effort. Then the enforcement begins. And as that parking citation, if there is enforcement, as that citation works its way through the system, it's not necessarily an efficient system. A lot of people got to get their hands on it. The enforcing officer, the supervisor, the records clerk, the court clerk, the judge, and through that entire system. And eventually, some of them don't get paid. That comes back towards council of, hey, we have 4 years of outstanding debt, and we end up taking a vote on that also. So it is a labor-intensive process. The police department's absolutely committed to one way or another. We have a primary role in creating the desired impact on there, and we'll do that. We just need that singular direction so that we can move forward with a plan that we can bring back to you.
Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I expounded a while back on the technology that's out there for parking meters, but I've also learned from people downtown that they're not crazy about them as a solution. It seems that, I guess I would like to at least consider kind of a two-phased arrangement. Council would have to commit to providing funding for boots on the ground to do enforcement first, and do a period of, call it 2 years, that we're gonna have significant enforcement. And then if we still don't like the results, we have the option to come back, and it's gonna be a considerable capital expenditure for meters, even if people did like them. So maybe a first phase is say, okay, we're gonna commit to help you get boots on the ground. Is that something you guys would consider?
It's an option. Steve?
Well, and I know I would agree and go along with Councilman Hopkins' idea there, because basically in '92 we went through this same thing and took the meters out. Now we're, for the same reason, now we're talking about putting them back in, and even in the putting them back in was the enforcement phase of it. And so I guess I would like to go ahead and, rather than hammering everybody all at once with meters and enforcement, to see us go ahead and see how that enforcement works out, and if that solves the issue, then everybody is happy. So
We could get more people to use the garage.
Make it free.
My suggestion was, go ahead, Kristen.
I was just gonna say, I have received a lot of downtown business owner feedback, and not a single one has been in support of meters.
Well, and that's an issue for us to force this down everyone's throat. If we really have the business owners in opposition, we've got some education to do or some persuasion to do. I certainly don't want to be a part of that. But now, would there be any way to meter and simply not charge people for the space?
Parking enforcement?
No, I mean, you'd get a ticket for 2 hours to park, but you don't have to pay anything for it. If it expires, you get a ticket.
Mayor, yes, technology exists for us to pull that off. Absolutely. The efficiency, the efficacy of meters is it eliminates the boots on the ground aspects that are required. So remember the first scenario, we gotta go around, we gotta mark the tire, we gotta document it, we gotta come back. Versus the meter eliminates that whole process. The meter is the evidence that the time has now expired. And so the efficacy of how much man hours go into is greatly enhanced with the meters, and absolutely under the current technology, people could get out, they could enter their license plate in there, it starts the clock, and then it would flash the meter and it wouldn't be charging them anything.
If the objection is that it's a disincentive for people to have to pay to park on the street, could you just remove that disincentive by saying, you can park on the street, but only for 2 hours, and it's free. If you stay there longer than 2 hours, you're gonna get a ticket. I'm just throwing around ideas because we
I can
did get a lot of
remove the valve
pushback.
core in about 10 seconds.
What's that?
I can remove the valve core from the right rear tire in about 10 seconds.
Steve?
So I had a meeting with 3 business owners this morning that are right there in the OID, and they were kind of all over the board at first, but then one of them brought up the fact that the biggest problem is a lot of the employees that are parking out on the street themselves and the lack of the use of the parking structure. And so a couple ideas were thrown around where the parking structure, first of all, is free for the first 2 hours, correct? So if people use the parking structure, don't make it free, but you could certainly validate tickets to where it essentially would be free. But you could validate tickets, and that'd be an incentive for people to use the parking structure, and they wouldn't actually have to pay to the meters themselves. If you have employees that continue to want to park in front of their business, if you did meters on the street itself, then whatever, for a lack of numbers, just say the first 2 hours was $1 per hour, but then after that it jumps up to $5 per hour. So if somebody wants to sit out there all day long, then they could pay a higher amount of money to sit in front of that meter. It's just kind of, do you want to park there? Do you want to take the extra steps to walk from the parking structure over to your business? It might be a block away that you don't want to walk, and save yourself some money. They could go down to DDA and get themselves a parking pass, and it cost them roughly $30 per month to park. All the employees cost them $30 a month, whereas when you do the math on it, you do $1 for the first 2 hours and $5 after that, you're probably going to spend that in the first couple days anyways. And then as far as enforcement goes, most of the businesses don't open until 10 o'clock anyway, so maybe you run the enforcement from 9 until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when most of the employees that are the issue leave anyways, and open it back up to free parking after 5 and free parking until 9 a.m. Just some thoughts.
Steve?
One of the games I've seen the people play, be it with the meters or the stripe on the tire, is they still won't pay that $5. They'll go out and move from that parking meter to another parking meter every 2 hours. And that's one of the things I know a lot of the non-retail downtowners have played that game for years, is that they're independent businessmen renting an office, so it's no big deal every 2 hours, run downstairs, move their car, go back to work, and they play that game all day long, and have for years.
But correct me if I'm wrong, that 2 hour parking downtown is one time per day, whether you use the 2 hours or not, correct?
Mayor,
Sure.
you know, you're asking me a technicality. The signs say do not, as I recall, the signs do not limit you to one parking spot for 2 hours.
I thought they did. I thought it was one time per day in that downtown area for up to 2 hours.
And I would, and Mayor, Councilman, even if that was the case, that presents an enforcement issue that it would be astronomical to try to guess. Like, was that one parked there earlier, but now it's moved to here, and did they already use their one spot? You know, I think the intent is to limit it to 2 hours of free parking. The legislative intent of this body was to limit it to 2 hours of parking to create that. And so we have, you know, admittedly, the Casper Police Department has over time, has got an ebb and flow of their ability to enforce it. Right now, I'm down to one community service officer, and it's just not happening. I freely admit that right now. When we're at full staff, and if we go back to, previously we had a dedicated community service officer that was dedicated by council for that purpose. Upon her departure, that position was eliminated as a budgetary move. So we can address some of these things. We absolutely can. But I think that the intent is to create that movement to discourage people that otherwise would park there all day and should be using the numbers that we reported. Currently, an employee can get that topside parking for $14 a month. That's 50 cents a day. That's well within virtually every pay scale down there.
I think Kim was waiting.
Something I think about, and this is my opinion, strictly my opinion, is I'm not for the meters. You put in meters like you guys were saying, I think it opens the door to force the meters or trying to move them. That's my opinion. Not that council's doing that, just that's how I look at it. I look at, dare I say it, the food trucks. They want to park down there, they want to park their thing. Do they have to pay for all those meters? Do we give them a pass where we don't others? I think about that, them coming in, or is that pushing them out even further from downtown regarding that? So I think about them when summer starts coming up. I'd rather open up jobs, give people the jobs to be down there, to be watching that, than to have a machine take away that to a point. Not completely, because you still got to have somebody, but rather have 2 officers downtown and pay that wage than to not. So that is my opinion, not that any council thinks the same way.
Who was next, Mike?
I'm just sitting here and I'm trying to think and clarify in my mind the context that we're talking about here, what the complaints and what the problems are that we're trying to address. And I think that if I'm not mistaken, there are complaints and concerns that there's inadequate level of parking supply in certain critical areas. And so, how we address that, am I remembering that context correctly?
Turnover here, Honor. And
Yeah,
the mayor had talked.
Well, but the fact that we're not getting turnover
Yeah.
in those critical areas is what's creating the impression that there's inadequate supply. Is that?
What we're trying to do is the exact opposite of what the downtown merchants fear. Downtown merchants fear that we will disincentivize going downtown because people will have to pay to park on the street. When in fact the intent is to do the exact opposite, to create the belief that if I go downtown, I'll find a spot. Whereas instead of driving around looking for a spot, there will be a spot for me. So it's just a completely different way of looking at the impact. So, and who's right, it's hard to say. So I'm sorry, somebody else was going to
But the problem is not we've got enough spots, it's just that they don't get turned over, and especially in critical areas.
And times.
And so how do we make people turn those spots over?
That's the goal. And
If there's a crystal ball out there.
I hear what Chief
someone
is
would
saying, how
figure it
labor
out.
intensive it is to mark cars. I mean, that's a system that goes back to the 30s, I suppose. So, Sean, and then Steve.
I don't think we're gonna solve this 100% with any of this. I mean, you can play your games with the meters like Steve talked about. I think self-enforcement is probably the better option. If the businesses want to have those spots open, then they need to self-enforce. I mean, you're not gonna force businesses to police their own employees through taxation and fines. So I think it's more up to them than it is us.
All don't even know what vehicle an employee drives.
They should.
Steve?
This is a
Well.
technical question about the enforcement portion of it. Can you, for lack of a better term, chip parking spaces? So that instead of having to mark the tire, all you have to do is drive by, flash the license plate, and
Oh, an RFID.
yeah, and it'll turn around and tell you, assign a parking spot number, so then you could actually even track without ever having to get out of a vehicle, like the water meter people do, the electric meter people do, is you just literally drive by and it starts registering parking space, license plate number, and actually you could even track then the people that are playing the I'll move my vehicle every 2-hour game, and say at the end of the day or the end of a week, you run a quick spreadsheet to where, whoa, this guy is showing up 8 hours a day in one of those parking places, and then he get that address that's listed to that license plate gets a letter to basically knock the garbage off, or you will be getting a severe fine. And I don't know whether that's possible or not.
Chief?
Mayor, Councilman, excellent question. Remember we discussed last time, the technology exists for the automatic license plate reader system to be mounted to a car and tie in with our computer and with our database of license plate records. So the only thing the employee would have to do would be to drive down the road, and the cameras would be capturing all of those license plates as it goes. 2 hours later, we drive down the same road, and it would have already taken a picture of it the first time around, and the computer would then alert us, okay, that white Ford F-250 right there, license plate, one county, 1234, is in violation. That system's expensive. I have deliberately not come to council trying to purchase that system. For the time being, I'm still waiting for the technology hiccups to get out of the way so it becomes 100% reliable. That system does exist. The system that we're going to is a hybrid of that. We have a handheld device that helps us capture that information rather than the chalk on the tire kind of stuff. So we've elected to go with a hybrid technology, waiting for the technology to come full circle so that it's not so prohibitively expensive, and we're assured of its reliability and long-term reliability.
I was basically just wondering if there was a way to use technology which starts to become more of a one-time than the labor, which is 8 hours a day, every day. So
Sure.
So Chief, if that system were in place, then tell us why the meters?
So remember from the discussion before, I would not need the meters. That would be a very efficient process. It is very expensive per vehicle to equip it with, but the technology exists to even put it on a golf cart sized vehicle. But it does kind of tie up, a fleet dedicated to that purpose. We're okay with that. The primary concerns are right now is the current expense, and two, the long-term reliability of it. Historically, for the last decade, when technology's been around, it works good for a month or two, and then the data becomes so large it starts to bog it down, and then a few months later, police departments are calling up the vendor saying, come get your stuff and get it out of here because it no longer works. I have a personal experience with that, and until I get a more resounding, they've fixed those problems, there's a reason why I just haven't brought it to council in a budget request.
But it would be less labor intensive than the chalk marking.
Absolutely. All we got to do is very quickly drive down the road. It captures all of that data all by itself. It captures the picture of them in the parking spot. It captures everything we need that's evidentiary in nature. We do our route. We come back 2 hours later, and it pops it up on your screen. Go back. That green Impala is in violation. It also gives us one of the things I do like about it is it gives my employee a heads up. The person who is registered to that vehicle is a wanted fugitive, and that's important to me because I don't want my unarmed employees unintentionally coming into contact with somebody that would have malicious or ill intent. So there are aspects that are wonderful. Without question, within the next 5 years, you would be seeing a proposal from me once I found a system that met the criteria of not wasteful technology spending that I think would be solid for the long haul here. I'm very careful about what I spend my technology dollars on because technology is just moving so fast, and there's so many companies out there that they'll give you a song and dance.
Mm-hmm.
But then when it's here and implemented, then they don't answer the phone anymore.
One more follow-up, Stephen, I'll get to you. So would it be possible for you to guesstimate how long the payback would be for that technology and reduce labor costs?
Mayor, I would be winging it, but in all things in all services that the city offers, without question, personnel are the heaviest cost. If you were to add up the hours of everybody that's got to handle that parking citation, then whatever fine that the judge would never add up to all of the hours spent by our personnel in handling it. So anything that reduces that cost is going to be money that we're going to recapture very quickly.
Steve?
So I guess at the end of the day, though, if you bought that technology, then we either implement saying 2 hours per day and that's it, or that Impala could, after 2 hours, drive around the corner, park again, and we still have the same problem. We're still moving vehicles from one spot to another. So back to the, you're talking about you have employees downtown in self-policing. I mean, this is great technology, but at the end of the day, if they wanted to go out and move it to another parking spot, nothing you can do about it.
That was where my suggestion was, is there a way to incorporate then the 2 hour here and the 2 hour there to where, whoops, dude, you've been down here 4 hours, here's your ticket.
Well,
Because what we're talking about too, and Charlie brought up a very valid point, the comment I was making about moving the vehicles every 2 hours, those are not retail employees.
Correct.
Those are downtown office.
And hence the problem comes in of self-policing. If you have people in office buildings, that it just doesn't matter to them because they don't have customers coming in and out. But then you have people that are selling fly rods or restaurants, whatever it might be. Those are the people that want that turnover. The other
Exactly
people don't.
right.
I still think that's a small percentage of people that play that game. Ken, and then, I don't know who else is, Ken and then Mike. Go ahead, Ken.
Problem with that is you get an out-of-towner that goes down there, parks at Egginton's, they choose to leave there, drive around, go to the fly shop. Egginton's, you can spend an hour or two in there bulk wrapping and stuff, or especially out-of-towner learning and stuff. So now you're gonna, if you do it one time downtown, now you're going to ticket that out-of-towner, or even if I go downtown with my family and we wanna walk around downtown, I can only park there once for 2 hours, and then I gotta park where there is outside of that and then come back and walk. That's not, I don't think that that's right either. So I mean, you would have that issue if you did 2 hour parking one time per day. That's not right.
We keep talking about these evil downtown people that are gonna one up all the parking places. I don't remember, has that been quantified in any way in any of these parking studies? Or is this the mythical Loch Ness Monster, or is it a real problem? I suspect it's probably somewhat of a problem, but so that hasn't been quantified.
Anecdotally, you hear people say, I see that same car in that same space all day long, but do we have data? Of course not. I mean, it's just not obtainable.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something, Chief?
Yeah, I just wanted to try to answer that. Very hard to give you a quantitative analysis. I can tell you that I have had business owners call me up, come down here, I have a parking problem, and I'm speaking with the business owner. Well, whose car is it? Well, that's my employees. Well, whose car is that one? That's my employees. Well, it looks like your employees are part of the problem. I guess they are. So anecdotally, I think evidence exists. I think there's a whole lot of wink wink that goes on down there. But again, the laws exist right now for 2 hour limits. The police department absolutely can do a better job of enforcing it, and we intend to as soon as my staff is replenished on the community service officers.
Just seems to me, so I'll get to you, Mike, but it seems to me that if there's some chance that this technology you're describing would improve in the next few years, we could risk investing a lot of money in meters that we don't really need. And that they would themselves become archaic. I don't know, Mike?
Well, so the way it exists now is, in theory, the first 2 hours on the street are free, the first 2 hours in the parking structure are free. Is that right?
Yes.
You know, I'm just kind of wondering if if what we really shouldn't do is try to really promote and bolster use of the parking structure, you know, put some signage up, something saying, you know, 2 hours free parking in the parking garage. I don't, you know, I'm not Pollyanna, I don't think that's gonna solve everything. But, I'm just really bothered by the idea of putting in meters, because I've lived here long enough. I've seen meters come and I've seen meters go, and every single time that they come, it's because, well, it's gonna improve turnover and all that stuff. Every single time that they go, it's because, well, we're gonna try to make it more inviting for people. And so I just hate seeing that history repeat itself. But you know, if I was the smartest guy in the world, I'd have the answer to this problem, and
I
I'd
have
probably
it.
be somewhere else.
I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I have an answer.
Yeah.
If every business owner gave their employees a sticker that they put on their car, and we randomly located cars in the parking garage with that sticker on it, and there was some kind of reward system where you would get some kind of a cash or
The
gift
key
card
to
or
the city.
something just because you were in the garage and it was random. There's good research that says that people will work harder for the chance to win something than they will for the thing itself. So,
Green stamps
rather
and
than
lotto tickets.
going always to the punishment angle, you know, because yes, if we get more people in the garage and they paid that $14, but I think it needs to be, I think it needs to be carrot and stick. So, Kristen?
I'm not gonna sit here and argue that $14 is a lot of money, but have we considered subsidizing downtown employees being in the garage specifically?
I mean, the DDA is running it for us, and they've got a balance sheet. They have to pay the employees, and so, you know, they're trying to make that garage be solvent, essentially. So that's a challenge for them. But Steve?
Along those lines of the DDA, I was gonna say, since it's the DDA people that are concerned about this, rather than the city council implementing this, would the DDA should we be involving the DDA in this discussion, like your proposal about the incentive for them to implement that type of a program amongst their people?
Probably
And-
more the DCBA than the DDA, I
Okay,
think. But,
and the other thing is, talking about incentivizing, Councilman Huber had mentioned putting up more signs about 2-hour free parking in the garage. Maybe what you do as well is, instead of 2 hours, you make it 4 hours, so you get double the time downtown if you park in the garage. So again, this is incentivizing people to try to go to the garage rather than just the 2 hours.
and
Because,
again-
yeah, if
and
you
again,
go
we have
downtown with your wife and you go to Fashion Crossroads and Lou Talbert's.
We want
and
people to be downtown.
Someplace else, yeah. You're gonna chew up that 2 hours in a
I'd be
heartbeat.
fine with people being downtown all day, you know,
Exactly.
we don't want to disincentivize that, so.
Is the parking structure, is that, I don't wanna use the term losing money, but is that costing us money every year? Or
Yes.
is it, and so it's costing money every year anyway. And so, yeah, so I would say why not?
Well, it doesn't sound like we've got a strong sense from council, we wanna move forward on meters right now. So, but if the argument's there, Keith, I think we need to go out to the business owners, make sure they understand just how difficult it is to enforce using the current system that we have in place and the advantages of going to a newer system. Go ahead, please.
Mayor, thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt your flow of thought. I feel compelled to, we keep calling it meters. And bear in mind, that is, you know, we're picturing in our minds a pole with a thing on there and a red thing that flashes when you're over limit in front of every parking spot. You know, I would recommend to you that when it came time to actually discuss some type of pay for parking feature, probably is not going to be that. So instead of having that significant financial outlay, buying 400 meters and installing them in the ground and worrying about, it's a single, generally speaking, it's a single pay station. It works with smartphones and things like that. You know, so I feel compelled to point out it's probably not going to be that outlay of lots of money for those 1,000 of those, you know, poles with a device on top of it. It's going to be something that's going to be more current on its technology.
I'm sure you're right, and other people probably thinking the same thing. Go back to that 1990s, you know, technology. Well, council, what do you want to do? We're probably gonna need to move on.
I'd still like to try increased enforcement as a first phase.
100.
And maybe some education as to the challenges amongst the business owners so they can see just how difficult it is for us to do it the way you've been doing it. And I guess I would like to explore that option of if the technology is not that expensive to put these pay stations in,
They're meters. They're paid for parking.
to have them be free. To basically take that argument away that it's expensive to park downtown. I don't know. Obviously, we wouldn't be paying for the cost of the system like we were before with the paid system, but it might be worth it for us to not have all those wages that we have to pay. So, what do we want to, does anyone want to make a suggestion? Steve?
I just want to add back to what Mike said. I think that we need to really kind of get something out there either on or on the parking structure itself, just to let people know. And other parking lots that we have, if they're public parking lots, let's get information out to people of where the free parking is, whether it be the structure, it be over off of Ash by David Street, that parking lot there. Point those out to people so they know where they can go and they can park, and that will help alleviate some of this too.
Mike, and then we better move.
Well, at the risk of suggesting that we study something to death, you know, what I would suggest is that as a first step, we do what Councilman Hopkins is talking about. As a second step, we look at increasing the length of free time in the parking structure to 4 hours instead of just 2 hours. That we look at your idea of incentivizing people to you know, employ businesses down there to encourage their employees to use the parking structure. That might be in the form of what you were talking about, Mr. Mayor. It might also be in the form of that we need to take a look at what, you know, what do we charge employees to park in the parking structure? And maybe that should be discounted some more to, you know, to encourage the secretaries and the guys on the second and third floor to use the parking structure. Kind of incentivize using the parking structure as a second part of doing something.
Could we do this, Liz? Could we get some rough idea of how that would impact the budget for the parking garage if we were to make it free up to 4 hours? And if we were to reduce the monthly fee to 8 hours, maybe for $8 for employees or something like that, and maybe some additional ideas about how to educate people about the availability of the garage, and
other public lots is what I heard.
and maybe we need to go to a DCBA meeting and explain why it is so difficult to do quote-unquote enforcement. Because when people use that term, what they're talking about is the old system of the chalk and the tires and all of this that's been so difficult. And that just seems in today's world, I just can't believe we're still doing that. But that would at least get us a chance to move forward. And then maybe you guys could think about whether it would make sense to buy the pay stations and still make it free so that we don't have that argument that it costs money to park on the streets. If it's a bad idea, it's a bad idea. Any other suggestions people want to float? Are people okay with Bob's idea?
I'm
that
not
we
quite
just
clear on
grant-
where we're going here. Could you run those by me again, because I'm not sure I got it.
We're gonna look at, Your Honor, we're gonna look at, what the financial implications would be to, I'm gonna say our parking budget, because that includes the structure as well as the lot on Center Street, parking budget, for 4 hours free versus 2 hours free. We're gonna look at the potential to make the cost for employees downtown cheaper to, less expensive, I hate the word cheaper, less expensive for them to park in the structure than, we'll say, a downtown shopper. And then we're gonna talk with the DCBA about the cost of enforcement, but also, to me, I think a little bit of self-policing if it's possible. And then we're also gonna really look at, putting up some signage and doing more education, and not just with signage, I mean, we just talked about wayfinding signage, but just education in general through our downtown partners, DDA, DCBA, on parking in these public lots that we illustrated back here, and really trying to encourage that.
Maybe kick-
Off-street parking.
Maybe kick around some ideas of incentives, if it isn't a random drawing or random, reward for somebody that has a sticker or something similar so that.
The councilman had a great prize in mind.
Ken, and then we better move on.
Dinner with Ray.
Yes, dinner with Ray.
So the 4-hour parking would be free for anybody, but then we're also talking about an incentive to maybe lower it for employee parking. But I guess my thought is I don't see the point of doing the 4-hour parking for free when they can move and do stuff. But the incentive for the employees, I do agree with just helping them out to park there more, because we want everybody, whoever, to park in the garage as well as on the lot, but I don't see why we need to do the garage 4 hours free.
Do it all, you mean, versus looking at it separately?
I'm saying get rid of the 4-hour free and just do incentive for the employees to park in the garage. So like that, dropping it down to $8 an hour, because that's what my thought is. And then the meter station, I'd like to ex-nay for a long time before we look at that, but that's me.
Let's get the data. We're not gonna decide anything.
Nope.
Well, let's see what the impact would be of making it 4 hours, and maybe that's too big of an impact,
Correct.
so. Tom?
Mr. Mayor, just, I think it's already apparent, but just so we're all perfectly clear, that the metering type of parking is off the board, and that's nothing that you want to consider.
We're not doing it now anyway.
Okay.
But it clearly was a recommendation from the parking study, and so I think it would not be appropriate for us to completely dismiss it if all of these other things fail. Are we okay with moving on? Is that enough for you right now, Liz, to come back to us? You're okay, Tom? Yeah. All right, cool. All right, then let's move on to Historic Preservation Strategic Plan.
A real story.
Okay, back in 2018, the city was awarded a $7,500 grant to the State Historic Preservation Office to assist in the creation of the Historic Preservation Strategic Plan. And I believe we're ready for the final presentation of that, so I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Collins to lead in that discussion for me.
Just a quick tee up here, Mayor, members of council. As Mr. Pillock said, we were awarded a $7,500 grant from the state to complete this plan. Our consultant is Preservation Solutions. She's out of Idaho. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here, so she's going to, on the phone, join us, and we're going to run through the PowerPoint that she put together. And just wanted to note also that we do have one member of our commission here, Robin Bromley. So if you have any questions as we go through this, Robin or I are happy to jump in.
All yours.
Yeah, that's.
The number you have reached has been disconnected for the If you feel
Good
that you
sign.
have reached the
That's gonna help
recording
us
in error,
to-
Always a good sign.
check the number and dial it.
I think that's the same guys that tell you your computer's gonna be shut down if
Oh,
Yeah,
Lord.
exactly.
But I'm a Nigerian prince, Bob. Just send me money.
I was a little more big than trouble with this stuff.
You'd be amazed the calls that I get. But he said that he's a
This is
prince
Harry.
and that he'll marry me.
Hey Carrie, it's Jolene Martinez with the City of Casper. We're
Yes, hi.
We're teeing you up for, and Craig Collins is here to take over, and we're ready to go with with your presentation.
Excellent, thank you.
Go ahead, Carrie. I've got your presentation up on the screen, and I'll flip as you tell me.
Okay, sounds good. Well, first I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to present this, and I appreciate everyone's time and energy towards this. I really do. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to assist with this and to work on some projects over the last several years with the Historic Preservation Commission. So thank you very much, everyone who's present. I'm going to do a pretty quick overview of things. It's not a problem to circle back if there's anything that stands out that we need to revisit, but I just want to make sure we cover all our bases first in the amount of time we've got, and then if we have extra time, I'm happy to answer any questions. So if we could just move to the next slide. I just wanted to start with just the project purpose and to explain a little bit about this. This historic preservation plan it's not unlike a comprehensive plan in that you look at where a community has been, where you're at, where you want to go, and then how to get there. And that is this essentially the kind of the format of this plan. It's like a huddle where you've had a lot of successes in Casper with listing of your downtown historic district and various other projects and redevelopments in the West Yellowstone area, and now it's time to huddle again and look at, okay, now where do we want to go for the next 5 to 10 years? So this plan charts a course for the preservation program there in Casper for moving forward. This project was partially funded by National Park Service funds that pass through the State Historic Preservation Office, and those are funds that are earmarked for certified local governments. Casper is a certified local government, which means that Casper is in a partnership with the State Historic Preservation Office, and that agreement means that Casper has been certified and has the ability to manage its own historic preservation program. And to that end, that is the point of this plan, so that Casper can continue to manage its own and have a viable preservation program as it has done in the past and to continue to do so. So in this plan, we identify, again, this is going to probably sound kind of similar to comp plans and other city documents where you identify community goals and you outline tools and incentive programs and then recommendations for implementation. So if I could get the next slide. So why do we do this? Well, historic preservation really is integral. It's an integral element of community development. It's part of many community interests, including housing, sustainability, transportation, livability, and economic development. And we'll talk about economic development a little more in a moment. But when integrated into the planning process and targeted at identifiable areas, preservation provides a level of certainty and permanence that can really attract investment. You know, if you think about places you visited, a lot of times it's the historic downtown that's the most viable and the one that is, you know, on the postcard and is the, you know, is the image of a community. And you all know that well because you guys have protected your downtown well, and it's great. So you really identified that as an asset and should be applauded for doing that. And so that's the point of this plan, is to then, you know, while you have been successful and you, you get a minute to rest, but you know, instead of resting on our laurels, what's next? You know, what are the next challenges that you are being faced with, and how do you as a community and as a city prepare and move forward through those challenges? So this plan touches on many subjects that appear, like I said, in other city planning documents, but also while presenting additional program-specific action. While we're on this slide, I just want to hit on the economic development piece of this briefly, is that in historic preservation, there are federal rehabilitation tax credits that are available for historic buildings. There are a number of economic studies that have been done over the years, particularly after the 2008 recession. A number of states, including the National Park Service, conducted economic feasibility studies to really analyze not only the federal tax incentives, but states that have tax incentives, to see, are they really proving out? You know, are we just is this a giveaway? And what many states found was that they actually are making money for their states. They're not losing money on these. In fact, these incentives actually end up making money, and it's a great return on investment for state governments as well as the federal government. In fact, with tax reform a few years ago, when so many other tax incentives were cut, one of the few that made it through was the federal historic tax incentive, because again, through heavy analysis and critique, it was found that it really does prove out, and preservation does make money for communities. It stabilizes property values. It ends up being a job creation tool because preservation is more labor intensive rather than materials intensive. And when we get materials intensive, we're often just, you know, importing materials from China and putting up a building real quick with the new construction. But with rehab, you're often spending a lot more labor. It's labor intensive, so money tends to stay locally. And there are examples to these kinds of economic studies available that we can absolutely make available to anyone present. I won't take time to get too far in the weeds on these, but and lastly, just, you know, from an economic development point of view, it's just that it also recapitalizes on your existing infrastructure. You know, the city has already made investments on streets and sewers and so forth. So, you know, it's just continuing to recapitalize on money already spent. So if we could go to the next slide. So this preservation plan, some of the components are a synopsis of Casper's development history, the overview of preservation in Casper in the past, going all the way back to 1925 with the founding of the Natrona County Historical Society, an analysis, kind of a mini audit per se of the existing cultural resource management program, and a summary of property type patterns. So what that means is kind of looking at what are the property types that are present in Casper that are the built environment. What are the trends that you see? So for instance, single family homes like the ones you see in this slide, or, you know, the industrial buildings that are over on the East C in Burlington, you know, the various different types of property types, you know, the different character of homes in different neighborhoods. So looking at, you know, obviously your downtown resources, your auto-related resources in West Yellowstone, so kind of seeing what are those property types and finding patterns and groupings of those and shared characteristics of those that are unique in Casper. So there's a section in the plan regarding that. And then looking at, there's also a list of preservation program priorities, and those are linked directly to the extensive public outreach that took place and the public opinion poll, which I will get into in a moment. And then the last component, of course, is the recommendations and implementation plan. So how to get there and how to meet those goals that were identified by the public. If I could get, sorry, next slide. We should be on the one with the Marco Lanes.
Yep.
So some of the activities, just to kind of keep you up to date, what were we up to? We did a lot of research looking at previous documentation, city records, the collections of the Western History Center at Casper College. We also did considerable field studies. There was a windshield survey, which is, we drove many, many, many miles of Casper over the course of several days. Not only the downtown and West Yellowstone and that Burlington area, but also everywhere from North Casper, south to Casper Mountain, and all the way from Hilltop west over to Paradise Valley, and just looked at everything so that we could see, everywhere within the city limits of Casper, so that we could see and help anticipate areas that may be, that may warrant attention or study, or what have you. So wanting to be as comprehensive as possible. And then we took, the research, the field study, we did some synthesis and analysis, and continued with a review of the preservation efforts. And then again, as I mentioned, the public opinion poll. So, I'm sorry, can we move to the next slide? Forgive me. And then using that analysis of public input, that's where we really directed the identification of the various preservation actions and programs that support the community objectives. And again, that being, what did the community want? So I recognize very, very clearly my role as an outsider. So this plan does not represent an outsider's perspective. It's not what the state thinks y'all should do or what I think y'all should do. It's what Casperites directly responded and said that they want. And what I bring to the table is merely some of the familiarity with some of the tools that are out there and some of the successes and best practices in comparable communities, so that it could help identify recommendations for how Casper can get where Casper wants to go. So we can move to the next slide. Should be the public outreach with the float. I just really want to spend a moment on this because it really is the watershed piece of this project. We had a public opinion poll that was available online and also was provided in hard copy at a number of events over 5 months from October through February of this year. That public opinion poll, the 12 had 12 questions and included everything from getting a sense of who we were talking to, who was responding, all the way to their ideas on what buildings were important, threats they saw, and we'll get into that in a moment. The various outreach activities included radio interviews, interviews with the newspaper. As you can see there, the commission put together a float for the parade, the winter parade, and at the various public events, we engaged with hundreds of Casperites and were able to get nearly 200 respondents to answer the 12-question poll. And overwhelmingly, that those respondents, the poll really illustrated that and it documented a strong support for preservation citywide. If we could go to the next slide. So I'll just highlight briefly a couple of the questions and the poll results. This one here illustrates an open-ended question that folks were asked: what is a historic place that's most important to you? And this word cloud really represents and illustrates everyone's answers. And I think, you know, most of these are probably not surprising to folks because these really are your landmarks. And they're some of the most identifiable buildings in Casper. And so yeah, this illustrates that question. And then if we could have next slide. It should be the one with the bar chart on the bar graph. Just two selected additional poll results I'd like to hit on is the first one was asked, what do you believe are the most serious threats facing historic properties? And as you can see here, it was lack of understanding of the value of historic resources as well as lack of funding, and then of course development pressure. Those are some of the things that Casperites identified as what they see on the ground are the threats facing historic properties. So if we could go to the next slide, not only did we ask about the threats, but what do you think we should be working on in the future? You know, what should the preservation community, the city, the Historic Preservation Commission, and others, what should we be focusing on as a community? And it really, what the overwhelming majority, it was education, not only of the general public and decision makers, whether that be elected officials or building owners, but education clearly was among the top as far as responses, as well as, again, a source of sustainable funding that might be available. And the plan identifies a number of existing funding sources as well as recommendations for how to get there. So if we could have the next slide, it should be identified goals. So as I mentioned, the public engagement, which was, as I said, the watershed, it was the longest piece really of this project, was gathering and garnering that input to make sure that this plan really does reflect where Casperites want to go. It's kind of like, I think of it as a map or like a trail map. If you're trying to decide where to go, it's like, which mountaintop are we going to try to get to? Let's decide then, and then you have to identify the goal as it, so we identify the goal of this is the peak we want to hit, and then we're going to have the road map or the trail map as to how to get there. So the goals, the 3 peaks per se that were identified by respondents were these 3 that you see here in this slide, which is strengthening historic preservation efforts, cultivating public awareness and partnerships, as well as, again, really hitting on that economic development tool. So if we can have the next slide. So once we've decided the goal on this trail map, here's how to get there. We identified not only action steps organized by goal, but also prioritized by timeline, so that there can be really just a list of, and a prioritized list, so that these can be attainable, that they can be kind of, pecked away in a methodical fashion to work toward, again, just like hiking a mountain, you do it one step at a time. And so the idea being that we broke this down into one step at a time. And so I won't go into what was recommended for 10 full years, but the first tier of recommended steps are identified here, which, as you can see, include, some training and some outreach efforts such as recognizing good preservation, expanding and improving the Historic Preservation Commission website, just to make sure that constituents have ready access to knowing what is out there, what's been done, what's being done, so they know, and then directly notifying property owners of available incentives. So these are just some of the recommended steps, those kind of step-by-step implementation tool, actions to get to where everyone identified that they would like to get. So at any rate, that's that. If you go to the last slide, I know I kind of blew through a lot of information, but I just wanted to hit the overview. I don't know if we've run out of time. If we haven't, I'm happy to answer any questions. that may, if anyone has any concerns, comments.
Thanks, Carrie. Hold on just a second.
Questions for Carrie? Else? Comments?
We got a lot for our money. She did an outstanding job, so I just want to say that in front of everybody.
Sounds like it.
Well, and I have to chime in. I couldn't do it without you guys. I can't believe, I don't know that I've had a historic preservation commission or staff that has done so much. I also have to extend the applause to everyone there as well.
Thanks.
Especially over the last several years too. It's just, this really is a great, smart step to huddle like this after several, successes in the last several years, and I think it's really proactive to integrate this into planning.
Well, hopefully we're in a different place than Casper was in the 70s with urban renewal and the complete destruction of the sandbar district. So,
yeah, yeah, that is true. I think we are. I think I agree. That would be nice if there was some of that area left. And you know what's crazy is that urban renewal stuff's almost 50 years old. So some of that stuff is kind of almost becoming historic in its own right, which is a whole nother can of worms and agenda item we can discuss another day. But
if there aren't any other questions for Carrie, thank you very much for your presentation. I think we're seeing a lot of head nods in the room, and obviously you did a great job for us.
Okay, well, don't hesitate to let me know if there are any follow-up questions or anything I can answer. Would you like me to stay on the line for anything, or?
Does anyone need to have any further comment or questions for Carrie, or can we let her go? I think we're good, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bye, Carrie, thanks. So, Mr. Mayor, I guess the next step would be setting it for a future council meeting and doing a formal adoption, and then staff will get to work.
And then would you be giving us some periodic updates, Craig?
Absolutely.
How we're doing with the implementation of those? Okay. Maybe every 6 months or something like that?
Sure.
Is that okay with everyone, so we keep track of what's going on?
Just get my plug in. Right now, our budget, yearly budget for the Historic Preservation Commission is about $3,600. So our volunteers do an outstanding job with few resources. So if there's anything we can do in the future to get those resources increased, and we'll look for other opportunities, that'll sure help things.
Certainly something you could bring up next April when we start our budget deliberations. So. Okay, then if there's anything else, we'll move on to the tree and shrub ordinance. Tom, did you want to tee this up?
Just real briefly, this is related again to the tree and shrub ordinance. Just coming up for the third reading. As I stand, I believe these discussions, there are some proposed changes that will be discussed. And I may turn over to Mr. Cortez and Mr. Henley to give more detail on that.
Members of council, I'll keep my comments pretty brief to kind of tee this up, because I'm pretty much just looking for what you might have for me as far as questions that might have arose out of the last meeting. And then just to kind of give you a quick synopsis of what we're trying to do here. This was a topic that was brought to us by the people in the industry and the citizens. This wasn't something that staff had come up with for us to look at. And it is, for us, it is something that covers commercial arborists. We're not looking to change things with the way the general public goes out and trims their trees and shrubs on their private property with their own private property. That is not the intent of any of this. We do have one amendment that is included in the packet that we would like to do. We do view it as a friendly amendment, meaning it was brought to us by the industry folks that were like, hey, if it's under the permitting section. They said, hey, if you want to see permitting every time that someone wants to trim or prune something in the boulevard, and for clarification, the boulevard is that little strip of land that sits between the street and the sidewalk. And just so you know, those trees that are residing in there are maintained and stuff by the property owner. However, it's still city of Casper property. I mean, it's our trees technically. So it's kind of a weird deal where you see things kind of blended up. But the amendment pretty much gets at, we don't need to see permits from the people in the industry whenever they're just going to trim or prune a tree that's within that boulevard. Meaning it is our tree technically, but the homeowner has called them up and said, hey, I'm too old to get on a ladder and trim that thing or whatever. Can you come over and trim it? And they can say, yeah, and they don't have to pull a permit. So that is what the intent of the amendment that you see within the packet. If you wanted to flip to that, or if you wanted to remind, that's on page 6 and starts at line 21. It is a kind of a short and sweet amendment that we think helps people in industry, helps the citizens, and then it keeps my staff from being inundated with permit requests. And that's the gist of it. So I can address some of the questions that I think come out of the last meeting. Meaning there's no grandfathering. There really isn't a grandfathering aspect to this ordinance, other than if you were in the tree industry for more than 3 years, you do get credit for that when you go to get certified. And so there is. So when you hear somebody say, well, so and so's been in the tree industry for 10 years and now we're going to be out of business, it's really not necessarily the whole truth, because they would get credit for 3 years and above, and now they just got to go to the ISA, apply, take a test, and then they would be certified. Other than that, I think that's all I have. I know that everyone's probably ready to move on and stuff, but I want to make sure I answer your questions.
Because we put this on the agenda because people weren't ready to pass it in at second reading, so.
Third, actually, it was up for third reading.
I'm sorry, yeah, third.
And I apologize that I don't have these things written up in a more formal manner to be able to give to people, but the whole focus and the problem, and Mr. Henley can attest to this, that I keep looking at this and I would keep getting confused because I would lose sight of the fact that this ordinance, the focus of this ordinance is to regulate commercial arborists. And I would keep losing sight of that fact. And so what I got thinking about is let's go in and let's change some of the language in this to make it really clear that this is to regulate and license commercial arborists. And then there are a few other little incidental sections in there that will regulate what private property owners can do. And so, for instance, what I did, and I promise that this won't take too long because I just want to give you the thrust and the flavor of what I was trying to do here. I went to page 1 and line, I think it's line 21 of this, and this starts out, this chapter addresses the care of trees and shrubs. And to make this really clear right at the start, what I would propose and what I'm going to move to is to amend that to where that would read, to promote public safety and the care of trees and shrubs. The primary focus of this chapter is to govern licensing and conduct of commercial arborists. This chapter only governs private property owners and their family members and businesses and their employees who may occasionally be involved in tree and shrub removal, trimming, or maintenance on property owned or controlled by said business when specific reference is made in this chapter. So for instance, like when it talks about what they can and can't do on the boulevards and some things like that, then that makes it clear, okay, those things apply to everybody. All the rest of this stuff, what I'm trying to do is make it clear that it applies only to commercial arborists. And then if you go to line 28, I think, on that, I'd want to underline commercial arborists to emphasize that is the case. If you go to section 12, 12.32.20, what I was wanting to put in there is language that on line 4 there, that applies to work being performed by a commercial arborist instead of potentially work being performed by everybody else. And then in section when subpart C of that, then I'd want to insert language in there that any person who is not a property owner or family member or an employee of a business owning or controlling property, that then that makes it clear once again, that hopefully makes it clear, that property owners and their family, and if it's a business, their employees, are not what we're getting at here. What we're getting at is commercial arborists. And there are one or two other little places like that. And what I would just ask at this point, if the general consensus of the group is that I'm barking off in a strange and bizarre direction and there's no interest in doing this, I don't want to waste a bunch of time with this. But if the general consensus of the group is in agreement with what I'm trying to do here, to say this focus is on commercial arborists, and to make some clarification in some of these, some of the subsections, that this applies to everybody, this applies only to commercial arborists. If the consensus goes along with what I'm suggesting, then what I'm going to want to do is sit down with Mr. Henley and kind of get this language into more, you know, hammer it out in there and make sure that we're not pushing in here and it'll bulge out over there kind of a thing. And so I would just ask, you know, that general idea sound good to everybody, or does it sound like I'm barking off in a strange direction?
Reactions, Ken?
I'll be honest, I like it that you want to identify this is for them, this is for these guys. I think I like it.
Because if I was, the way I look at it is, if I kept reading this over and over, and I kept getting confused about what's going to happen to a private property or a business owner versus what applies to a commercial arborist, and if I figure if I wasn't smart enough to figure that out, I want to try to make it so that everybody can understand that right up front.
Are there reactions to Mike's proposal? Bob?
Just a question, you're saying this would be presented at the next regular meeting? I don't remember when it's on the schedule again.
I think it's
November 5th.
November.
So it would be the next regular meeting?
Yeah, the next regular meeting. And it'd be up for third reading, and so I'd be moving to make these amendments at third reading, which I think.
I guess I wouldn't oppose that, as long as we get it sometime
Sure.
before third reading.
Sure.
Not in the meeting.
Like a minute before?
Yeah.
Does that address some of the concerns that came up that had us basically tabled to the 5th? Kristen?
Did anyone, and this is on me just as much as it is anyone else, did anyone reach out to the super helpful individual from the UW Extension Office that had her list of things that she was concerned about? I mean, she's much more
I
an
did
expert
not.
than any of us.
But, you know, what I addressed was the reasons, my reasons for
Yes.
wanting to table this and do
Yep.
this. If somebody wants to give me those other ones, I'll write them down here and we can, I forget what that nice lady had to
You
say.
want-
I believe you're talking about Donna Hoff.
Yes.
Yeah.
From the
Yes.
University. So I did reach out to her
Thank you.
the next day, just to kind of reel in and, because I was kind of losing track of some of the things that she was trying to pull in, and there was kind of 3 topics in there, but after we visited about it, it's not really essential in the ordinance. She was kind of pointing out details that we
Okay.
will need to discuss after the ordinance kind of gets beefed up, if you will. Basically, she's saying we got more work to do, you know, and I think that the folks in industry would say the same thing. We are not turning out a gem of a product here that has got it all answered. We kind of focused on the piece of, you know, making sure that people are certified that are being hired by folks to do work on their property. That was kind of our general focus. We did a little bit of housekeeping around that area, and to include permitting, which is kind of the amendment that what I started with tonight, and also that same exact section. The section was kind of reiterated with Councilman Huber's with just a little different language, but I think it meets the intent of what we're looking at. She felt comfortable after I got off the phone with her that we still got work to do, but as far as us needing to get something into the ordinances that was a deal killer, if you will, it wasn't there.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
And Mr. Mayor, if I might just make one more quick comment. As I went through these things, I didn't have any problems with any of the sections that refer to the licensing, to the city parks department, to those kind of things. I was just really focusing on how do we make sure that people understand applies to commercial arborists and what other parts do apply to everybody.
The essential thing in the definition being for compensation.
Right, and then there were a few other things where.
Who a commercial arborist
Yeah,
is.
and in there was one reference somewhere that it referred to a licensed arborist, and I tried to look through and make all the language consistent that it would refer to commercial arborists instead of, like this one place said, licensed arborist. Well, then there was no definition of a licensed arborist, but you could kind of infer what that would be. But just some things like that.
I'm sorry, Ken.
Two things. One, is that the same, what you're talking about, is that the same thing that Councilman Kathy wanted to talk about or bring up also, or did he have his own thoughts and had his own things that he wanted to bring up?
Well, his concern was, what about somebody that's been, quote, in the business for a long time and wants to continue doing that? He used the example of a guy that worked for the utility, for the power company forever, trimming and things, and wants to keep doing that. I think that person is addressed, probably not to everybody's satisfaction, but it's addressed in what Mr. Cortez is talking about, that there are ways for these people to become licensed. Yeah, there are hoops that you have to jump through, but if they're going to be out there holding themselves out, what do we do? Do we sit there and say, well, if you work for Rocky Mountain Power for 2 years doing line maintenance, you don't have to be licensed? 5 years you don't? 10 years you don't? I don't know how you sit there and legislate to accommodate that guy that's been doing it forever for a business. And it took a little while for me to find in this proposed ordinance, but it does talk in there about, in essence, utility companies that are maintaining their right-of-ways don't have to be licensed commercial arborists. And so, yeah, there are people like that out there.
And that would count as experience, Tim,
Yeah.
right? So all they have to do is pass the test, and if they can't pass the test, then they didn't learn very much during that 10 years that they were working out in the field.
I
Would
think
that be a
that's
fair statement?
Fairly well put statement.
Here's the reason why I bring that up is Councilman Kathy is the one that also asked for this to be tabled, and unfortunately he had to leave, and I'm wondering if we can bring this back up next week's Tuesday meeting, because we are having a next week's meeting, right? Work session. To allow him to state any thoughts, opinions, where he stood, because he sounded like he had a lot more than just that, and I would like to hear what he had to say. I know that means we're pushing it to then, but I'm just asking if you guys would be willing to consider that.
I don't have any problem with this. I will say this, that Steve and I co-conspired on the idea of tabling this. We debated which one of us was going to make the motion and which one was going to second it. But yeah, he had those concerns. I did not address those concerns. I have no problem. What I'm planning to do is to get this written up so that you guys can look at it and see where it fits in. Because I'm really sensitive to the idea that I want to have, in any legislation that we come up with, I want to have consistent language all the way through. So in this section, it's not telling you to do or not do something that contradicts what's over here. That's a big deal in my world.
Right.
But in terms of addressing what Councilman Kathy was worried about, you know, I didn't, because when I looked at it, I was satisfied with what Mr. Cortez is saying, that, you know, there's an avenue for that person. And it wouldn't be like if just you or me walked in and said, here, give me a license.
So I'm just asking if council would be willing to entertain that idea for Councilman Kathy, regarding that.
We certainly could. I mean, I think his objection was that utility worker
And demolition.
and the demolition.
He wanted to
And
bring
did
it
we
back.
address that? I thought we addressed that.
I think he might have made the amendment once, but I think he was planning on making it again.
Right.
At least it
But
sounded
didn't-
like it. I can't speak
thought
for
we
him.
fixed that,
but-
didn't
And
we?
then,
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just to refresh your memory, Mr. Mayor, he proposed an amendment for the demolition area if they could be exempt from having an arborist on site.
Yep.
And that was voted down by council.
Oh,
Yep.
that's right, yeah, so.
and then he wanted to echo what Mr. Steensley brought up about allowing, if my neighbor wanted to, if my neighbor said, hey, I'll help you cut down that tree, too, because it specifically says only family, he wanted, if I remember right in the comments, he wanted to, mention that as well, what Dennis Steensley brought up. So that's why I'm just asking if we can, if council would be willing to entertain it for next Tuesday, also at the special meeting, to allow him to bring it up.
And you'd like to see Mike's stuff, we'd all like to see what Mike's stuff
Yep.
looks like with those changes. Well, let's put it back, is that okay with everyone? Put it back on the agenda and we'll get a chance to look at the altered or the revised language and then see if Steve has any other further objections. Because he also said he was just against the ordinance as a whole.
But I do think we tabled it to a date certain. So November 6th, I think, is our next regular
November 5th.
council meeting. So we'll have to, you know, we'll have to come back off of the table then.
Well, we have a meeting on the 29th is what Ken is saying.
Yeah, next Tuesday, it's a
Well-
fifth Tuesday, we have a special meeting, work
So we
could
session or
review it.
whatever. And I'm asking it for it to be
I got no
done.
problem with reviewing it. then.
Okay, so
I'd
let's-
like to do that.
Okay, well, let's do that, and then if Steve has anything else he wants to add,
I
we'll
would
discuss that then, so.
suggest, in case any of you haven't, Google tree felling mishaps or tree felling gone bad. There are some videos there that are just horrendous.
We'll have to discuss that. I mean, anybody can say, I'm the guy's neighbor, so,
You're
anyway.
now the ad hoc committee along with John to fix the ordinance, right?
Right.
All right, so we'll put that on the agenda for next week. How much time do you think we need for that? We're gonna do the agenda setting next, but, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, more? 20?
Yeah.
20 minutes?
To discuss trees?
All right,
Oh my God, I hope not.
that's a nice segue into our next agenda item, which
Well,
is
so we're an hour
the
behind, so I'd
agenda,
say
well,
we're not
actually,
good
we
at
were gonna add that to the
estimating time.
29th.
Sorry,
which
15
is-
minutes now.
And the
Now that we sped this
executive
up.
session on the 29th will be land and personnel. And so now we're moving ahead to, because we have our agenda for the 12th already hammered out.
Yep.
And so, next challenge is the 26th, which is completely open. So, suggestions for what we would talk about on the 26th of
I would go with the guys we already got outlined in yellow.
Yep, me too.
That seems to be our usual way of doing
It
this.
seems to work.
Anything else that people want to see move forward? Personally, I guess with property code revisions, they're waiting, want us to wait till January, fair enough. Okay, we're gonna wait for Maddie until we got closer to the legislative session, if I remember correctly. Council participation on boards, what was that about?
I think, well,
I think that was about who do we represent when we're on those boards. Do we represent the city, or do we represent somebody else? And I see Mr. Henley shaking his head. Some direction.
Do you have something?
I think that is correct, and I had sent actually out a memo on that to you all confidentially. So basically, we're talking about kind of the legal constricts and potential conflicts of interest that we may have in various capacities.
He sent a memo out to us about.
So, would this be something then that would end up in the council handbook at some point if we hammered out some guidelines? Is that what you're?
It certainly could, yeah. I don't know how you would go about that, if you wanted to discuss it, you wanted to memorialize it in the council handbook, or a rule, or a resolution, or it just would be information. Or if you've already received it via writing, and that's sufficient.
I'll leave that up to the rest of you. You want to discuss that or not? Steve, you do?
Yeah, I think it should be
Okay.
discussed.
I do think, I mean, obviously I'm all about accountability. I do think it'd be a really good point of discussion when we're just talking about, you know, in what capacity we're there, as far as like if there's somebody who maybe is sitting on a board but has attended like 1 out of 12 meetings, then discussing as a group, like getting that reassigned to somebody else. Because at the end of the day, it does look bad for all of us when one of us is on a board and isn't showing up. And so it's not like a accountability of like bad you, but accountability of us as a group making sure that someone is showing up when we say they will.
Okay. Yeah, and having made those assignments, I have on rare occasions been in the comfortable position of having someone from a board say, could you get me somebody else? And that's an awkward situation for the mayor to be in because
Yep.
you don't wanna, you know, tell somebody they're doing a bad job.
Well, if anything, it just opens the discussion of, you're like, yeah, you know, I did say I'd do that one, and it turns out my schedule changed, now those Tuesdays really don't work for me.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's put that on the agenda then. How much time do we need for that? 20 minutes?
Yeah.
See where it goes? And then, how much time, well, I guess we'll let staff decide how much time we need to talk about dog parks, financial guidelines, and the city safe project.
I think that's plenty.
Or does that seem like it's getting too long?
That's enough.
Dog park's gonna take some time. We don't have to do all of this. Any suggestions?
I don't think the other ones are.
How much do
I
you
don't
think,
think-
time you think you need on financial guidelines, part
could be
three,
wrong.
Tom?
20 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
And the city safe project, part 2?
Hey,
Yes, yeah.
Have anybody here to answer that?
me?
Well, let's do this. Let's put it on. Let's put all of these things on the agenda for the 26th, and then on the 12th, we'll look at again. We'll have a better sense of how much time this is all going to take, and if we want to take something off.
Yeah.
Is that all right? Okay.
Did you want the council participation on boards on the 26th?
Yes. We'll just put it on there as kind of a tentative. How's that?
Dotted yellow.
Yeah, there you go. Or my business provisional. Okay, legislative review, I don't think there's anything to report right now. We had our mayor commissioner meeting, and of course we're monitoring the progress of the WHAM and WCCA proposal that the 5th cent be made permanent, that the 6th cent be available as it currently is with the consent of the majority of the municipalities or governmental entities, I guess, and that the 7th cent then be available as a special use tax. And we'll see how that fares in the legislature.
Oh, I think we know how it's gonna fare.
Shoot ourselves in the foot.
So,
We're gonna ruin every chance you'll ever have of getting any kind of voters to vote for anything by doing that.
so, okay, around the table, Ken?
I only got one thing, and that's people's concern about, and I kind of mentioned it before, but people's concern about gals going around town top list and it being okay, and daycares are worried about being able to take kids to swimming pools, to David Street, to anything of that nature during the summertime. How are you gonna get parents to sign off on that? Other people concerned about the different clubs that Rec Center does and the YMCA does, that the kids go out and they see that, what are you know, how's that? So I don't know what we can really do about it, if anything at all. I just was bringing it up that it has been brought to my attention that it is a concern that daycares, groups that go out with kids, having to worry about that, how to explain to parents this took place, is becoming a little bit more of an issue, but that's it.
But it's not something we don't have to worry about for several months. It's chilly out there.
It's 10th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled on that.
Right.
Yeah, and at this, we literally have like
Banning
a
women from being topless in the municipality was the reason that they overturned it. You can't
Exactly.
do that. It's equal protection under the law. If a man can do it, a woman can do it, period.
Yeah, if you don't agree with that, we have bigger problems. Nothing tonight.
Bob?
Tonight, we heard a good presentation from the Historical Preservation Group. There are a lot of communities, not in Wyoming, because it would take major changes. But quite honestly, one of the things that occurred to me is that the special purpose excise tax, you don't have to allocate that in whole pennies. You know, I can't remember, but one whole penny is what, like $1.3 million a month, plus or minus? But if you gave them 1/10 of a penny, that would be a way to actually help do some of that stuff. You could do a similar thing with trails. So I'm just trying to keep alive that we need to get people on board with a special purpose excise tax. Enough said.
Anything else? Ray?
Nothing tonight.
Mike?
My only concern was the reconsidering Lane's Furniture, which we addressed earlier, and I think that's a positive thing, because I've gotten a ton of comments about that.
Okay. Steve? No. John? Nope. Just a couple things to let you all know. Let's see, we had the governor of Wyoming sent a letter of support for our build grant, which was very positive, and again, our local CADA group played a significant role in reaching out to the governor and getting his support for that. He wrote a very strong letter in support of that, and so, again, that increases our chances, and that award will come out very shortly, and it's a big deal, because it's $1.9 million to finish those last 2 blocks. Was at the Clarion opening, and Councilman Bates was there as well, and the Clarion is, they're going full bore. I mean, these folks are not, I mean, they're very committed to Casper. They're excited to be here. It's a beautiful facility. You know, hopefully with the name change, people will give it a chance. And of course, with that branding, there's much easier, it's much easier for people to book a room now. And so they're heading into the period with lower bookings, and so it's a little more difficult, but they had, the food was out and it was excellent, so these people seem very committed, and I'm excited to see what they can do. Okay.
Can I add to
Sure.
that? The remodel of the cafe part, the bar, everything in that, if you haven't got a chance, go check that out. The remodel is, I think, amazing and really classy, really gorgeous. So.
I think it was 3.9 million is what I heard.
Wow.
So appreciate their confidence in the community. Let's see, went to the Housing Authority board meeting Thursday, and Housing Authority meant to pass this around. They have a 5-year plan that they have put together, and let's make sure we get that in the packet, because it doesn't make much sense to send it around now. We'll make sure that this is included in the packet here. I'll just leave it here. You can maybe scan that or get it electronically from them and put it in there, so we can see But they have, they've finished the work at the old Roosevelt School, the landing, and they're of course working to move their headquarters over to the old North Casper School. They have some very aggressive goals as far as increasing our public housing stock in Casper, so that organization's doing well for us. And let's see, I think that is all I have. Let me just make sure. Disability Council meets next week, CADA meets next week. Okay. Good enough. Thank you all. See you next Tuesday.
There's literally what could have been perceived as an active shooter situation at a school last week, and people are concerned about their children seeing a woman without a shirt on. That's what you're concerned about as a parent? You're not doing